Good afternoon and welcome to our first Lunch with the Libraries and Museums of the 2026 academic year. This series spotlights the unique collections, pioneering initiatives, and outstanding staff of the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums. My name is Claire Miller, President of the Friends Advisory Council. The Friends of the Libraries are one of the oldest university library support groups in the United States. Since 1931, we have provided financial support, advocacy, and volunteer assistance to ensure that the libraries remain one of the university's strongest assets, the heart of intellectual life at Hopkins. Today's program, Musical Treasures and Thieves, will showcase items from the library's remarkable and historic collection of bound volumes of sheet music. These rare collections of music offer unique insights into life in the 18th and 19th centuries. Leading the conversation is Sam Bessen, the Eleanor and Lester Levy Family Curator of Sheet Music and Popular Culture at the Sheridan Libraries. As always, thank you for joining us, and we hope today's program hits all the right notes as we explore the stories, craft, and history in these bound volumes.
Good afternoon. My name is Sam Bessen. I'm the Eleanor and Lester Levy Family Curator of Sheet Music and Popular Culture, and I want to thank the Friends of the Libraries for having me today. Now, today we are going to be looking at bound volumes of sheet music. If you're familiar with our sheet music collections, you may already know the Lester Levy Sheet Music Collection. And this is a collection of about 30,000 popular American songs which have been digitized. And these songs were collected by Lester Levy, who was a Baltimorean, because he saw them as windows into US history. So through these songs, you could study presidential elections, or wars, or social movements, or celebrities. But another aspect of sheet music history that's not as often examined are these bound volumes. And you can see an example of one of these bound volumes here. When I'm talking about a bound volume, it really is just a collection of these individual songs that were a kind of a personal object for someone. They would take their favorite music to a binder, and that person would kind of preserve it, and that's how we get these today. It was a very common practice. Unfortunately, it was also a common practice for sheet music collectors afterwards to buy these bound volumes and to cut them apart. And that way these collectors could access individual songs if they wanted to maybe only keep one of these. So you can see a couple different examples here. You can see these are just the surviving covers of some bound volumes. As I mentioned, it was quite common for these to be cut apart. But you can see that they have really beautiful custom embossed covers. You could get your name printed on the cover. You could have the date printed on the cover, such as this one from November of 1852. And if you look at the inside, you can also see that they had really beautiful customizable interiors as well. So this one, for example, even has the mark of who bound the song originally. And as I mentioned, a lot of sheet music is a window into US history, but more and more researchers are starting to look at these bound volumes as windows into a specific person. What can we learn about this person from their personal collection of sheet music? And in that way, I often teach these to students as history's first Spotify or iTunes playlists, basically. So most often, these would be taken to a professional binder who would have done this, but there were also ways for people to self-bind. So we have two examples here of binders that were self-bound. You can see this one actually has a needle and thread that was provided, so you could sew your own music into this binder. And this one, I really have no idea how it worked. It's one of the more complicated things I've seen, but this would have come with more detailed instructions for having used this. Another thing I really love about these volumes, which you can see in this one, is that, like I mentioned, they were personal objects. So if you look through this one, you can actually find small doodles that were made by the person who owned this one, such as a little doodle of a flower, which is very beautiful. So let's start with some context. Sheet music has been published in the United States from the colonial era up to the present day. But these bound volumes really saw their heyday from around 1820 up to around the 1870s. Now, 1820, 1830 is around the time where sheet music started to get more elaborate. They might have more colorful illustrations on the covers, more decorative. And around the 1870s is when you started to see musical tastes shifting a little bit more towards theater and mass production. And now, there's also a really interesting article by a musicologist named Petra Meyer Fraser. And she also attributes the decline of these volumes in the 1870s to a time of more opportunities opening up for women. Now, I always remind students, during this time, we are, of course, pre-phonograph, pre-radio, pre-cinema, pre-television. So if people wanted to experience music, they had to make it themselves. It's also a time where piano was becoming more affordable. It was still a luxury item, but a piano might cost something like $200 in 1820, which is around $5,500 today. So it was a sort of a luxury item that was becoming more accessible and might have been placed in the parlor of the home. It was also an expectation, as Meyer Fraser points out, that mostly white, young, middle and upper class women would learn to play the piano so that they could entertain themselves, entertain their friends and family, and court suitors as well. And there are even etiquette books that go into really specific details about how to do this. So I was going to read a couple of these etiquette examples for you. So one that I pulled from an anonymous book says, "Never exhibit any particular anxiety to sing or play. You may have a fine voice, but have a brilliant instrumental execution, but your friends may by possibility neither admire nor appreciate either." Another says, "Do not sing songs descriptive of masculine passion or sentiment. There is an abundance of superior songs for both sexes." And a third says, "If nature has not given you a voice, do not attempt to sing unless you have sufficient taste, knowledge, and judgment to cover its defects by an accompaniment." So these volumes in many cases were a way for these young women to preserve some of their favorite songs for posterity. We also know that it was very common for these volumes to be passed down amongst many women within multiple generations. So we have two really great examples of such bound volumes here that have a lot of really interesting family history that's been written on them. So in this one at the top, we have an inscription at the very back from July 6th of 1950, and it says, quote, "Went through this dear book, which accompaniments I played on, oh so many times for my precious mother to sing when she lived in Mount Carroll in Peoria. We played Rochester Scottish." This one down here, you can see evidence of 4 or 5 different people owning this one. So it has a cover label that says Frances Henderson. Inside of the cover is inscribed Janet Carruthers Henderson's music book presented to her by her most affectionate father, F.R.A. Henderson, in 1833. Next, on December 25th, 1885, we can see it was given to Hope Isabel Henderson from Newport, Rhode Island, by her niece, Mrs. William H. Henderson. Next, a little bit later, in 1905, it was inscribed to Matilda T. Freeborn from her husband. And finally, we have a printed label at the top noting it from Miss Alice C. Brenning at 228 Spring Street in Newport, Rhode Island. So you might be wondering, what styles or genres of music can you find in these bound volumes? Well, it varies greatly. Just as you can imagine, if you looked at 5 different people's iTunes or Spotify playlist, you would find a lot of different kinds of music. But in general, a lot of these songs you could describe as sentimental songs or sentimental ballads, which might be about love or nostalgia or family. But every once in a while, we will find bound volumes that have a really, really specific point of view that I really love looking into. So for example, this one in front of me here is entirely a single collection of German prints of patriotic anthems, basically. And you can see it's really beautifully illustrated. It starts off with the French national anthem, and it gets into a variety of other Portuguese here. So it's just really interesting to look through and see what all of these national anthems were at this one very specific point in time. We also have a bound volume here that is exclusively an improved method for learning how to play the Spanish guitar. And this even came with a note from Lester Levy, in which he notes that this is a rare guitar instruction book with beautiful illustrations. And if you look through, you can see really beautiful illustrations of people holding guitars. You'll have examples of how to hold the guitar, or even really specific information on scales and exercises so that you could learn to play with this book. Another one of my favorites is this one here, which is entirely dances for the piano, but each one has a different woman in costume on the cover. So for example, it starts with the Krakowienne, and then it moves on to another dance called the mazurka. And throughout these, you can see handwritten marks from the person who owned them, maybe making notes for themselves or notating which finger they should be using to play these. Now, I think something that's really interesting is what Maya Fraser points out in her article is what you don't find in a lot of these volumes. If you're looking at sheet music history, a lot of the music that's the most scholarly attention would be music about war, the Civil War in particular, and minstrel songs, which were a racist form of popular music that was very popular from around 1800 to 1920, in which performers would use blackface makeup. So Maya Fraser notes that these songs, minstrel show songs and Civil War songs, really rarely showed up in the bound volume she was looking at, which might indicate they were maybe less preferred in a domestic setting, or they really didn't fit the ethos of a bound volume of something that you would keep for yourself forever or maybe pass on to your kids. But she says, quote, "The music found rarely concerns the Civil War, a somewhat unusual discovery since the circumstances leading up to and following the most violent conflict in America up to that point was treated extensively by sheet music composers and publishers. It is inconceivable that young women were unaware of its abundance during the agonies that were all too present in the daily newspaper lists of casualties and calamities. Among all the categories of popular music and parlor music, war songs would have been the most painful reminders of wartime, and therefore least likely to be bound in personal nostalgic volumes of music." Now, we actually do have a Civil War era volume of music, and it's this one right here. Most of the songs here were published in the South, in New Orleans, and it actually starts with Stonewall Jackson March, a pro-Confederate song to the Confederate general. But what's interesting is as you look through this volume, you find music that was published outside of Louisiana. For example, we have some songs that may have been published in the South, but there's actually a publisher's stamp which indicates the song was purchased in Ohio, for example. And as you get further into the volume, you'll find even more songs published in the North, like Boston and Philadelphia and New York. So I did a bit of research into this volume to see if I could figure out, who was the owner, where did they get, this eclectic collection of music from, did they move? And I wasn't able to find that immediately, but I think this is a really good opportunity for a researcher to really dive deep into this volume to figure out who this person was, where did they move, and how did they amass this collection of music. Now, we also have some volumes that document some of the earliest music that was published in the United States. And the biggest family name that you can find when it comes to these early volumes is often Carr. So Benjamin Carr was born in London in 1768, but he moved to Philadelphia in 1797, and he was really one of the most prolific composers and publishers at his time. And he wrote what is the earliest surviving subscription series of music in the United States, and that is the Musical Journal, which I have in front of me, which was published from around 1800 to 1804. So this was a subscription. You could subscribe, and he would send you alternating vocal and piano arrangements of songs that he had either hand-selected or that he had written himself. Now, he published these in Philadelphia, but they were also published in Baltimore by his father, Joseph Carr. And as you can see, the print quality on our Baltimore version is not particularly high. It seems that the versions published by Benjamin himself in Philadelphia were a slightly higher quality. But nonetheless, it is an extremely rare and a really interesting insight into what people were listening to at the turn of that century. So he has a really interesting selection of songs here, early music, he has flute parts in here, guitar parts in here, and it's just a really, really fascinating volume. We also have from a little bit later, around 1805, a collection of sacred music that Carr published. And in this version, he has a really elaborate preface, but he even goes as far as to print all of the subscribers' names on the front here before he gets into the music. Now, if you know sheet music, you are probably familiar with the Carr name because the Carr name is associated with the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, for sheet music collectors, the Star-Spangled Banner is sort of the holy grail. It was the unicorn that everyone wanted to find. And the Star-Spangled Banner, as we know it, was of course written by Francis Scott Key and set to the tune Anacreon in Heaven by John Stafford Smith. But it was not published in sheet music form originally. At first it was just published in some local newspapers with just the words, as Key knew that folks were familiar with the Anacreontic song. But there was a rush after that. Everyone wanted to be the first to put the text and the music together in sheet music form. And the first to do that was Thomas Carr here in Baltimore. You can tell that it's a first edition because in Thomas's rush, he accidentally misspelled the word patriotic. And so this is the Star-Spangled Banner, a patriotic song. And he has a flute accompaniment here as well. Lester Levy looked into these while he was alive, and he had identified around 10 or 11 of these that were left in existence. So it's one of the more rare songs that we have from this time period, from 1814 specifically. Now, you may notice that on our version there are some tear markings on it, and these point to the historical story or the provenance of this particular song, which is absolutely ridiculous. So Lester Levy wanted this song. He didn't have a Star-Spangled Banner. He wanted one. All of his friends were looking out for him to see if they could find one. And he finally got a tip from his friend that there was a gentleman in Hagerstown, Maryland, staying at a hotel who was looking to sell a first edition of the Star-Spangled Banner. So Lester Levy immediately drove down to meet him. And he saw the song. He saw that patriotic was spelled incorrectly. He recognized this is a first edition, but he noticed that there are these sort of tear marks on the inside, almost as if this had been ripped out of a bound volume. And nevertheless, he purchased the song sight unseen and noted that the gentleman who sold it to him was a little bit nervous and kept asking Lester if he was going to go immediately home, if he was going to stop anywhere. Lester Levy did stop somewhere. He stopped at a local antique store and went in and asked the owner, "Do you have any sheet music?" And he said, "Yes, we actually have a bound volume in the back with an early edition of the Star-Spangled Banner, and someone was looking at it just this morning." So Lester Levy went into the back. He noticed that the song was missing. It was not there. He went out to his car and brought his version back in and noticed that the tear marks matched up exactly with the bound volume at the store. So he very honorably gave the song back to the store owner, who now knew that he had something very valuable, and he actually wouldn't sell it back to Lester Levy right away. He asked for either a couple of days or a couple of weeks to think it over, but eventually he did sell it back to Lester Levy, thankfully, and now we have it. And it is really one of my favorite provenance stories for any of the items in our collection. So let's take a look at a couple of bound volumes that were owned by some interesting or noteworthy people. So the one we're going to start with, as you can see on the cover, was owned by Mrs. Robert Arkwright. And there's been some relatively recent research done on this volume by our metadata and digitization specialist, Phoebe Evans-Latocha. And what she found is that Mrs. Robert Arkwright's name was Frances Crawford Kemble Arkwright, and her dates are 1786 to 1849. Phoebe found that she came from a theatrical family. She married in around 1805 and lived in Derbyshire, but she was known as a singer and as a composer. And so she used this book to collect some of her favorite songs, although interestingly, none of the songs in her volume are her own compositions. They're all compositions from other people, which may indicate that these were maybe early inspirations or people that she was using as a medium to write off of. But what I love about her volume is you can tell she's a musician because the very first song is an overture. It's an introduction, and it's a very interesting one. So this is Mrs. Robert Arkwright's volume. So the final volume that we're going to look at today was owned and used by the writer H.L. Mencken. Now, I will say I'm not a Menckenian or a Menckenite. I'm pretty far from a Mencken expert, but I do know he was a very polarizing writer. His literary critique covered pretty much everything, and there is undoubtedly some racist and anti-Semitic content in there. Of course, I don't have the time or experience to unravel all of his prose, but I am interested in what this object says about him. So we know that Mencken had a strong German-American identity and that he was very interested in critiquing popular culture. So let's start with the physical volume. And you can see it here, and what you'll probably notice is it's not particularly remarkable from the outside. It's far less elaborate than the other volumes we looked at. And that's because it dates from a little bit later. This volume in particular dates from about 1884 to 1902, when Mencken was age 4 to 22. Some of the songs also show some evidence of repair, meaning they were possibly used quite heavily, and one song even has a handwritten date from when Mencken was age 13. The songs are a really interesting mix between European composers like Wagner and Beethoven, but there's also some opera and popular song in there. So looking at what we know about Mencken in music, there's a very interesting article that was written called Mencken in Music by Paul Dannelly, and he starts with a Mencken quote, "In music, a man can let himself go. In words, he always remains a bit stiff and unconvincing," end quote. Dannelly also points out that Mencken started piano lessons at age 8 and continued teaching himself music harmony as he was a young adult, and even wrote some music around the time, around age 19, including some arrangements of European marches, kind of like the ones that you can see in this volume. So this clearly puts the volume around the time of his formative years, his early musical education, and I think can point to some of his views on classical and popular culture. Daniely also talks about a Saturday night music club in which people would get together around 1902 to play music, to drink beer. Originally, they would start in public, and then during Prohibition, they would move indoors into people's homes so they can continue drinking. Another work which provides some really great insight into Mencken and music is this book here, H.L. Mencken on Music, selected by Louis Cheslock. Cheslock was a friend of Mencken, and he was a member of this Saturday night music club, which met unfailingly for decades. And he was actually a violinist who taught at the Peabody Institute of Music. And he describes this group as meeting, like I said, for decades, I think every Saturday for 50 years, starting in public again in 1904, moving indoors during Prohibition. And in an interesting connection, this particular bound volume was actually donated to Johns Hopkins by Barry Cheslock, who was the son of Louis Cheslock, who wrote this book. So what insights does this bound volume offer into Mencken? In my opinion, I think it points to some of his early cultural influences. There's definitely a strong German identity in this book. There's lots of Wagner and Beethoven, for example. But it also shows his interest in popular music. There are some comic songs in here as well. So it's sort of a blending of this sort of high culture and popular culture that Mencken was known for. But I would enthusiastically invite any Menckenians or Menckenites to come visit us in Special Collections, take a look through the volume, and maybe share with us what you learned from it as well. But that is the last volume that I've chosen for you today. I, in particular, want to thank Phoebe Evans-Latocha, our metadata and digitization specialist, for all of her work as she is cataloging and identifying and researching these bound volumes, and she helped me choose several of the volumes that we looked at today. Thank you very much again for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to seeing if you have any questions or answers or thoughts, and of course, please always feel free to come visit us here in Special Collections. So I would encourage you to submit any questions you have to the chat. I'll do my best to answer as many of them as I can. To quote my colleague, Amy Kimball, we librarians don't always know the answers, but we tend to be pretty good at looking for those answers. So happy to answer all those questions. While you're typing those in, I wanted to share a fun experiment that I did related to the Mencken volume of sheet music this week, and it involves AI and ChatGPT in particular. If you have talked to your librarian friends about AI and ChatGPT, you've probably found us to be both cautious and excited about this new technology, and I would say I'm in that boat as well. But I wanted to perform this experiment. So I copied the list of all of the songs and dates of the songs from the Mencken volume, and I put that into ChatGPT, and I said, if I told you that a 19th century writer, American writer, owned a bound volume with this list of songs, could you guess who it is and provide a rationale? And immediately it guessed H.L. Mencken. And the rationale it gave is pretty similar to what I saw. It noted that the timeline for this bound volume fits Mencken, that Mencken was born in 1880. He would have been in his teens and 20s during the time these pieces were being published and played. It pointed out his German-American identity, the inclusion of Wagner's Tannhäuser, for example, other European works. It pointed out his musical background, that he played the piano, and then it pointed out the sort of cultural duality of the songs in this volume, that Mencken straddled elite and popular culture, and that is represented here. So I thought that was a very interesting observation. It, of course, sent me down a rabbit hole of asking ChatGPT what different writers and poets would have listened to. So, for example, Edgar Allan Poe would have listened to Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles, of course, and according to ChatGPT, Emily Dickinson would have listened to either Taylor Swift or Tracy Chapman. So with that, it looks like a couple of questions have come in already. So Cindy asked, do the libraries have actual iTunes or Spotify playlists where we can listen along to these mixtapes? That would be fun. I agree, that would be really fun. And it's something that we've done in similar contexts. When we had an exhibition at the George Peabody Library, we had a Spotify playlist where you could listen to the music that was on display. And I've also seen different departments at Hopkins put out study playlists for students during exam time. But as I mentioned, our metadata and digitization specialist, Phoebe Evans-Latocha, has been busy cataloging these bound volumes. We hope to digitize some of them. And so I do think it would be fun to create a Spotify playlist for each one. I see another question from Gabriel here. They ask, do we have any idea how much these volumes would cost? That's a great question. They continue, was the sheet music always purchased separately and then put together by the owner, or did the binder get put together? Did the binder put them together as like the Now That's What I Call Music anthologies? That's a great question. I like to imagine these would have been Now That's What I Call Music 1825. In my experience, these songs would have been purchased individually and bound together, although I'm sure there are some examples of some publishers or stores binding together popular songs, or maybe the guitar instruction book, for example. I can see it being feasible that that was bound before being purchased. I have not seen exactly how much it would cost to bind one of these. Songs could have sold for a couple of cents at the time, so they were accessible, but they were not cheap. And the sense that I get is that if a family could afford a piano, for example, a luxury item like a piano, that a bound volume would not have been far out of reach. That's a great question. I see another question from Cindy here. She says, love the idea of the thematic volumes, the national anthems, drinking songs. Are there other interesting thematic groups in the collection that you find particularly interesting? Yeah, that's an interesting question. And it reminds me of a blog series that I did, I think back in 2021 and 2022, which I called Deep Dives into the Collection, which I think you can still find on the library website. But each one dove into a different, very specific subsection of sheet music. So one of my favorites was trapeze artists, for example, covers depicting trapeze artists. There was a series of music about balloons when ballooning was popular. There was a whole series that I did on birds and parrots on sheet music covers. So there are a lot of interesting themes, and that's something that I love about the Levy collection is, yes, it is a music collection. We have a lot of students and faculty that work in music and musicology, which use this collection, but you can make connections to pretty much any aspect of American history through this collection. And so we also have a lot of historians from various disciplines that will reach out and use this collection. Another question that I get pretty often about these bound volumes is about conservation. As you may know, we have a really fantastic conservation team here. And you may have noticed from the video, a lot of these bound volumes, if they're not completely cut apart, they are in pretty rough shape and need quite a lot of care when you're looking through them. And then some of them, like the Mencken volume in particular, is in fantastic shape and there are no conservation concerns. So something that I always look for when we're starting to work with these bound volumes, we have about 60 to 70 of these volumes. The first thing I'm always looking for is mold, and we did find a couple of volumes with mold back in 2021, and I was grateful for our conservation team to quickly take care of that and make them usable again. And then we're always looking to figure out which of these bound volumes might be used frequently in teaching, and if it's going to be used quite often, as we do allow students and staff and faculty, or even members of the public, if you'd like to come visit us and look through these volumes, you're more than welcome to. And so we kind of look to use to guide which of these volumes we might bring down to conservation to get a little bit of extra help with. Another question that I got, how can folks access these collections and search for things? That's a great question. As I mentioned, you are always welcome to come visit us here at the Sheridan Libraries. But the Lester Levy collection has been digitized. It's about 30,000 popular American songs. It's one of the larger digital collections on music, and it's one of the largest digital collections that we have here at Hopkins. So you can view all of these songs that are not under copyright online if you look up the Lester Levy sheet music collection, and it's got a pretty robust search engine as well. Let's see, another question I see, are there any other great collections of bound volumes in the US or around the world, or is Hopkins' collection a truly unique one? Very good question. So there are a couple of other institutions that I'm aware of. Harvard has quite an extensive bound volume collection that I think they are working their way through cataloging. There's also a very large collection at the University of Colorado Boulder, which is right up the street from where I did my undergrad at the University of Denver. And that's actually where Petra Meyer-Fraser based her research, was on the large collection. And there's also quite a collection at Library of Congress. Something I love to do in my free time, especially when I'm traveling, is to stop in antique stores. And that's actually how Lester Levy acquired a lot of his music, was at antique stores. And you'll find when you visit them, most antique stores these days will have historic sheet music. I found plenty of things that are in the Levy collection, but there are also some antique stores, even in Hamden, just around the corner, that have bound volumes of sheet music in them. So my secret hope when I go through these antique stores and pick up a bound volume that maybe someone else hasn't looked through, with my knowledge of sheet music, is maybe I'll find a 13th or 14th Star-Spangled Banner first edition in there. I see a question from Beth. She says, I have seen some bound volumes connected to Eliza Ridgely at Hampton Mansion that seem to be related to her music teacher who had come to the US from France. Have you noticed any relationships to music teachers in the Hopkins collection? Yes, that's an interesting question. The biggest influence from music teachers that I see in these bound volumes are pencil markings and annotations in them. And it brings me back to when I was in music school as well, and my teacher would write in my method book, this one is due to play next week, or they would write in a fingering where I'm supposed to use a specific fingering. So you see quite a lot of these annotations in these bound volumes, which I absolutely love because it just makes it such a more personal connection to the volume you're looking at. I see a question from Cheryl. About cost and accessibility. From Sunday school catalogs, I have seen by the 1880s some pianos were available for as cheap as $50 to $100. Organs were as cheap as $25, were most of these volumes made for piano accompaniment. Yeah, that's a great observation. So yeah, there was absolutely a range of pianos available. There were also other instruments. So a lot of homes, if they didn't have a piano, they might have a guitar or a ukulele or another string instrument, or maybe even a violin or a flute. And so you'll see a lot of songs like the Star-Spangled Banner, for example, had a flute accompaniment, or you'll see songs that are for piano or guitar. And you can actually trace that all the way up to the 1920s and 30s, where you'll see songs from the Great American Songbook like Irving Berlin and Cole Porter and Gershwin, who were publishing piano music, but they had chord symbols or charts for ukulele and guitar. So the goal, of course, for these publishers is the more people that you make this music accessible to, the more people will purchase the music. But in general, most of the music that I see in these bound volumes is for piano. I see another Cheryl question. She says, I have seen several Civil War era bound volumes that mostly had the sentimental songs of the period, but included some of the comic songs of the period. Are there any notable funny songs that come to mind? That is a very good question. There aren't any funny songs that come to mind from the Civil War era for me. A lot of the songs I've looked at were particularly sentimental or nostalgic. I'm sure there are plenty of comic songs from this time that are just not coming to mind. The first one that comes to mind for me from the Civil War is usually Home Sweet Home. And it was a song that was actually sung by troops in both the North and the South. And there are even anecdotal reports of troops singing the song together across battle lines if they were camped near each other at night, for example. And it was reportedly banned by the Union Army for making soldiers so homesick that they would consider deserting. And I see another question. Do most of the volumes in this collection come from the Northeast? Yes. So the publishing industry in sheet music was largely based in this time around the major Northeast cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, but there were other major publishing cities like Cincinnati is another example. Chicago ended up being a big publishing city, New Orleans. And so most of the songs that I have seen, yes, were published in the Northeast. What I do love about these bound volumes too is even if a song was published in a specific place, some of them will have a stamp from the music store. So for example, in the Mencken volume, there might be songs that were published in New York or Boston or Philadelphia, but you can see that Mencken purchased them at a specific shop on Charles Street. All right, well, I think that's all of the questions that I see. So I wanted to thank you all again for joining me this afternoon. I hope you found these bound volumes as interesting as I do. They make me think quite a lot about my own hobbies. As an amateur musician, I have my own collection of theater playbills, for example. And these volumes always make me wonder what a historian might say about me 200 years from now if they saw that collection or if they saw my Spotify playlist. But our next lunch with the libraries and museums is going to be Thursday, September 18th. And my dear friend and colleague Michelle Fitzgerald will be giving a special tour of the Homewood Museum. So I hope you will join us for that. And for more information or to register for that program, you can do so at hopkinsathome.jhu.edu. But thanks again, and I hope you all have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend.